All right, so this sermon that I have for you today is similar to one that I actually preached back in 2015 with a dear friend and brother in Christ. His name is Bill Bryan. This was back when Maddie and me lived in Oklahoma City before we lived in Houston and then moved here. And back in those days with Bill, I was one of the co-youth ministers at the Ridgecrest Church of Christ. And I was a part-time youth minister. As you part-time youth ministers know how part-time youth ministering goes. It's more like a full-time job. But the elders allowed us to preach every now and then. And Bill and I would like to tag team preach. So I would preach half and he would preach half, and we'd get a nice little high five in the middle. And this is a sermon that me and him worked on, and it has really been on my heart now for the better part of a decade as I've been wrestling and thinking about some of these things. It's a sermon that touches me, and I want to bring it here today and share it with you because it's something that I wrestle with and something that I need to hear, and I think a lot of us need to hear. So what does it mean to be a follower of Christ? How should that look in my life? What needs to change about me when I follow Christ? Do I need to be all in? Do I need to be mostly in, somewhat in? How does that look and how does that play out? And that reminds me of the song we sing sometimes, less of self and more of thee. And that song ends with none of self and all of thee, God. That we need to be all in, that we need to be all about Christ. But I think in reality, we often look like the Israelite nation, that we're not all in, but we are struggling back and forth with the things of this world. When we look at the Israelites, we see that often they found themselves not obeying God's command. You know, they were God's chosen people. He set them aside. He saved them from slavery. He wanted to make them into their own nation. He provided for them. He cared for them. He guided them in all that they did. But instead of following God, instead of taking all those blessings and the love that God had given them, they went and instead wanted to give it over and look a lot like the world around them. God called them to be something different. God called them to be something greater, and yet they traded that in for the world and the culture around them. I have an example for you. Got to have a good visual, like every good sermon needs. So here we have a beach ball. This is not any ordinary beach ball. Today it's going to represent the world. So just imagine our beautiful earth and the world whenever we see this. And then think, over here we have God, and then over here we have the world. Now God called the Israelites to be set apart, and He called them to be different. They were to live differently. They were to eat differently. They were to clean themselves differently. They were to worship differently. They were to marry differently. They were even circumcised to show that they were physically separate and set apart from the world. And yet, almost immediately, we see the Israelites trying to hold on to the things of the world. We see them at Mount Sinai. When God is giving the law to Moses up on Mount Sinai, we see them down at the bottom worshiping an idol and instead giving their praise to that idol instead of to God who delivered them from the Egyptians. We see them then as they're wandering through the desert, as they are out there and they're struggling with food and water, but God is still providing for them. They cry out that they would rather be back in slavery, they'd rather be back in Egypt under the rule of the Egyptians rather than be this free nation that God set them apart to be. And then once they do enter the promised land, then they struggle not to be pulled into the culture and the customs of the people around them. As they go on the conquest of Canaan, and God says, go and destroy and root out these peoples so that I can establish this nation for you. They struggle. They don't do that. They don't get rid of these people. Instead, they take on their customs and their cultures. And when they do finally settle down in the land of Canaan, then they want a king. All the nations around them have a king, and they decide, we also, as Israelites, want to have a king. We don't want God to be our king. We want a king like this earth has. And then those kings take and they lead them into false gods. They lead them into bad practices and customs that ultimately lead them away from the king of God. Now, all through this, they are still God's chosen people. They are still the nation that God set apart, that God made to bring salvation to the world, bring salvation through them eventually. But even though they were God's chosen people, even though they were supposed to be this separate nation and fulfill a bigger purpose, they didn't want it. Instead, they wanted to hold on to the world. And the visual I want us to have today is keeping the world at an arm's length. And what do I mean by this idea of keeping the world at an arm's length? Well, that idea is that the world is over here, and we are just far enough away. We're just different enough that we don't look like we belong, but yet we keep the world close enough where we can pull it back in, where we can have all the joys and comforts of the world while still calling ourselves different and set apart. We see this with the Israelite nation. They had all these things that were different, but yet they wanted to pull in the customs and the culture and the people around them and those false gods and idols that they had. And just as the Israelites were guilty of keeping the world at an arm's length, I think today we do the very same thing. You know, we as Christians are called to be different. When we put on Christ in baptism, we're clothed anew, right? The old is gone, the new has come. We're meant to be completely different. But yet, oftentimes, we are keeping the world at an arm's length because it's so comfortable. And I see this in my own life, and I see this in the life of all of my fellow Christian brothers and sisters. And I want to say this as clearly as I possibly can to you today. I struggle with this. This is an issue in my life, and that's why I want to talk about it here today. Because I know if I'm struggling to keep the world, at an arm's length and not set myself apart, then I know that many of us are as well. I want us to bring this into the light so that it can be seen clearly and that we can hand it over to God. I want you to think about some of these things. Some of the things that we say and we talk about to each other. We are supposed to have words of love and grace and peace for each other. But how many times are we hurtful in the things we say and the things we do? We're guilty of talking bad about each other, of belittling one another, of putting others down while raising ourselves up. I can tell you, in this very church family, that I have been a part of conversations, and I have heard conversations that are full of complaining of the way things are done from this pulpit, of songs that are sung, of people that preach, of prayers that are given, because we ourselves are keeping the world at an arm's length and wanting the things of this world rather than giving ourselves over to God. We prioritize things that have no eternal value whatsoever. We pour hours into cheering on our favorite sports teams, like I know we'll be doing in a few weeks when the football season starts. We make sure our kids have straight A's, and we fill our nights and weekends with all kinds of youth sports. We work very long hours for jobs. We fill our minds with pointless TV shows and music and movies. We chase after money. We chase after promotions. We chase after accolades and awards. We're always seeking bigger and better and newer. In church, like I said, I'm guilty of these things in my own life. And that is why I'm here today, because I want this truth to come out and be known, that I do keep the world at an arm's length. The world is comfortable. It makes me feel good. It's easier at times to hold on to the world. I can be prideful. I can be prideful in things that I've accomplished in this world and say, look at me, look at all that I have done. And when I do need to let go, it can be very scary to let go. It can be scary to let go of the things of this world and just hold on to God. And, perhaps it's just that I'm lazy too. I don't want to put in the work. I don't want to put in the time. I don't want to put in the effort to get over that hump of letting go of the world and just looking to God alone. I need to give it more effort. But, the crazy thing about this is I've chosen this life. The Israelites, they didn't choose to be God's chosen nation. They were picked, and that was put upon them. But I'm standing here before as a Christian. I chose to take on this name of Christian. I chose to be baptized. I was not forced into that. I chose to follow Christ. I choose to come here in this worship assembly every week. I'm here of my own free will and my own desire. I'm here because I want to be with God for all eternity. I want to live with Him. I want His love and grace upon my life, and that is why I'm here. I want to be free from the bondage of sin. But in so choosing this life as a Christian, it means I've also chosen to follow the things, to put on those things and follow those things that come along. And I can't just say that I'm a Christian in eternity. I have to put those things on here and now on this earth as well. I have to be a Christian on this earth today. So let's look at Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Luke chapter 9, 23. and this is Jesus speaking, he said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself?" We see here that when we follow Jesus, we have to let go of the things of this world. We must deny ourselves, we must pick up the cross, and we must follow Jesus. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? Last week during Nick's sermon, he had a very good visual that I thought goes along with this. He said, we can live in the desert and we can focus on God all day, but I'm not actually doing what he said when I just focus on him all day. We are committing the sin of omission. There is a distinct difference between focusing on God and actually following God. Here's another example to give you that visual. Say I need my son Orion to help me with something. So it's a very important task, so I call him over, and I want him to make sure that he understands. So I take his little face and I hold it in my hands, and I have him look me in the eye, and I tell him exactly what I need him to do. And I say, "Orion, did you hear what I said?" And he says, "Yes, Dad, I heard you." And I say, "Orion, do you understand what I need you to do?" And he says, "Yes, Dad, I understand." And then he walks off and goes and plays outside and doesn't do what I asked. He heard what I said, he understood what it was, and he was focusing on me, but he was not following my direction. He was not following what I needed him to do. And this is the same way for us as Christians. I see this in my life, in the lives of others. We can read our Bible, and we can pray every day. We can see the words of God. We can study them. We can meditate on them. We can memorize them. We can make songs about them. We can put them on our clothes. We can listen to podcasts and sermons and Bible classes about the words of God. We can spend our whole life wrapped up focusing on the words of God. And they are wonderful, life-saving words of God. But then we must take them and we must follow those words of God. We must take them beyond a focus and an understanding into an active way of living, into following everything that our Lord has asked of us. So there's this beautiful idea that is found in Jewish teaching. You can find it in the Mishnah, which is a collection of oral Jewish teachings. It is this, the actual phraseology in the Mishnah is, "Powder thyself in the dust of your teacher's feet." It's this idea that we should be covered in the dust of our rabbi. A rabbi is a Jewish teacher. Now, there are several interpretations for what this actually means to powder yourself in their dust. Some Jewish teachers say that this means we are to sit close at the feet of our teacher, so close that as they are talking and we're listening, their dirty, dusty feet are near us and upon us. Others say that this teaching means that we are supposed to walk with our teacher down a road, and as they are walking in front of us and teaching, they kick up the dust, and the dust of them settles upon us. Now, we can take this and apply this to our Christian lives as we look at our rabbi, our teacher, Jesus, the one that we are supposed to be focusing on, the one that we are supposed to be following. How closely are we following Jesus? Are we following him so close? Are we paying so much attention to him that his dust is upon us? Or are we too busy keeping the world at an arm's length, looking just enough different from the world, but yet we aren't covered in the dust of Jesus Christ? Instead, what we need to be doing is turning and focusing on Jesus alone, following so near to him that we are covered with him that we can't have time. We can't hold on to the things of this world any longer because all we can hold on to is Jesus alone. We are seeking after him alone and not the things of this world. To go along with this, there's another Jewish teaching, and I know I'm pulling a lot of Jewish examples here, but our faith and the salvation that we have is built upon those forefathers that we had in the Jewish nation. And this idea that we have is this word of Shekinah. Shekinah, it's this idea of dwelling or settling. The presence of God is dwelling and settling among his people. The Shekinah of God. Now, this word is not found anywhere in the Bible specifically. It's just a thought or a way to look at some of the stories in the Bible. Examples of this Shekinah of God, of this presence and dwelling of God, we see especially in the Old Testament Exodus with the pillar or the cloud of fire that leads the Israelite nation as they leave Egypt. God provides the protection for them. He provides the way forward. They follow this pillar of cloud and it leads them where they need to go. It's the presence of God, the dwelling of him with his people. We see this again when the cloud comes down on Mount Sinai. When God is giving the law to Moses, we see his presence settling there. His Shekinah is upon the mountain. And also we see this again in the tabernacle, in the temple, when God's Shekinah, his dwelling and presence, is there in the Holy of Holies. He is there amongst his people. They are with him, and he is near them. The idea is that God is among us, and that we should be following his presence. We should be nearby to him. It should be greater than anything in the world that is calling out to us, because his presence is truth, and his presence is life, and we must follow that. Now, I know that we don't want to keep the world at an arm's length. I know that's not the way we want to live. It never feels good when you sit and think about it, that maybe I look a little more like the world than I want to. I know that we want to be covered in the dust of Jesus Christ. I know that we want to have his presence and his Shekinah nearby to us. So let's go back and look at the Israelites again. They did not do this, right? They ultimately were following the world, and they were getting tied up in the world, and God gave them over to the things of this world. We specifically see in the time when they are going to exile, and the Babylonians come and they destroy the temple, and they take over the land and bring all the Israelites into exile. We see this in the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations, which cries out about all the horrors that they have seen. And it lays out exactly why God allowed these failures to happen, because they were so wrapped up in the ways of the world. Now, if you go and look in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel really brings home some serious messages there for the Israelite nation. So Ezekiel is, God has given him a message, and he is giving this message to the Israelite nation as they're in exile in Babylon. And we see in Ezekiel chapter 23 that God tells them explicitly how he feels about them. Now, I'm not going to read from Ezekiel 23. There's a pretty graphic story in there that tells pretty plainly how God feels about the things that they've been doing. I will use the word once that God uses. He tells Ezekiel to tell the Israelites that they have played the whore. They have been so wrapped up, mixed up, and entangled with the things of the world that God has given them over to destruction. Now, we see that God has gone back and forth over generations and generations, giving them grace, letting them turn away from the evil ways and turn back to him. But then they throw it all away and go get wrapped up and mixed up in the things of the world again. And finally, God just says, if you're going to keep the world at an arm's length, and you're going to keep yourself mixed up and tangled up with the ways of the world, then you can have it. And they are sent to destruction. They looked just enough different, and they called themselves different, but in reality they weren't. They were just, well, those very descriptive words in Ezekiel. They were just playing into the things of this world. Now, unfortunately, I think we're starting to see this in a lot of churches here in America especially. And even some of the Christian colleges out there, I see this happening as well. That these churches and these places of Christian education have been keeping the world at an arm's length. Oftentimes you'll hear this excuse: we want to stay relevant. We want to stay relevant to the things going on in the world today. And yet, in so doing of staying relevant, all we have done is intertangled ourselves with the messy, sinful ways of this world. And yet we have become a distant shadow of what God called us to be, this set-apart people that is greater than the things going on in this world. And I think what is really happening here is the way we measure our holiness. There's been a rapid growth of us as Christians measuring our holiness against the standard of the world, rather than measuring our holiness against the standard of Christ. We let the world dictate if we are being holy, but only Christ alone can dictate if we are being holy. I know that a lot of Christian colleges struggle financially. It's hard to get the money in to make things happen. And so I think what's happening with a lot of these institutions is they're experimenting. How can we bend things just enough to make it comfortable, to maybe look just more like the world so that people will come here, so we can get the student body, so we can have the money to run things. But what's really happening here is holiness then is measured against what the student body wants and desires and not what Christ wants and desires. And this is a very heartbreaking thing because money cannot be what drives us. Numbers cannot be what drives us. Keeping the doors open cannot be what drives us. Standing on the Word of God alone, standing in the holiness of Christ alone must be what drives us, must be what sets us apart from this world. We can't keep the world at an arm's length. Another example to help bring this home. There's a church building. It's called the Hagia Sophia. If you've ever been to Istanbul, Turkey, the Hagia Sophia stands there. Today it is a mosque, but it wasn't always a mosque. It originally was a Christian church when it was first built. This church building was built back around the year 360 AD. And the building you see there today has been destroyed and rebuilt many times, so it's not the same one. But this Christian church that was built back in 360 AD has a very interesting story that goes along with it. Around the year 404 AD, John Chrysostom was the patriarch of that church. He was the minister, the preacher there. And here in Constantinople, which is what Istanbul was called back then, there was this great break between the work of the church and the ruling elite class. Now, the ruling elite class of Istanbul, they called themselves Christian, but they oftentimes took their money and their wealth and their power and they intermingled it into the work of the church in ways that should not be done. Specifically, the Roman Emperor Arcadius and his wife Eudoxia were chief among them. And John Chrysostom, he would stand at the pulpit and he would preach on Sundays against them, telling them to stop mixing their wealth and their power and their influence into the church, that they need to give their hearts over to Christ and let go of the things of the world. Well, the Empress Eudoxia, this made her very upset, and she had John Chrysostom exiled, had him exiled twice, in fact. This first time he was exiled, he was quickly brought back because the people loved his preaching and the truth that he brought. Now, when he came back, nothing changed. These elite ruling class still had their money and their power tied up in all the things of the church. And so John Chrysostom continued to preach against them, to tell them to let go of the things of this world and focused on Christ alone. And in this time, the Empress Eudoxia also had a silver statue of herself built. She thought so highly of herself that she wanted a statue that people could come and praise. And she had this statue erected right near the church building. And the story goes that one day, as they were celebrating Eudoxia in this statue, and as they were consecrating it to her, basically, John Chrysostom from the pulpit called out to them and said, "You're being sinful. You need to let go of these things. Stop praising yourself and your wealth and give yourself over to God." Well, this made Eudoxia mad, and then she had him exiled for the second time. So when John Chrysostom was exiled for the second time, all the members of the church rose up. They were angry and mad, and what they actually did was burn the church building down. Now, some say that they burned the church building down so that the church and the work of God would not be associated with the wealth and the statue and the sin of these ruling class of people. They wanted to be different. They wanted to be set apart, and they took a very crazy action of burning the church building down. Now, I don't suggest we burn our church building down. I think we have too many firefighters to let that happen. But I want us to get that image of how important are the things of this world. What are we doing to set ourselves apart? Are we willing to go and take a drastic measure of burning something to the ground so that we can solely alone focus on God and not have our hearts intertwined with the things of this world? I think that is something that each one of us needs to think about, and each one of us needs to make a decision in our own life. What are we going to bow down to? What is going to be so important to us? Who are we going to follow? When money gets tight, when the pressures of this world are turned up, are we going to follow God, or are we going to keep the world at an arm's length? Will we entangle ourselves in the ways of the world, or are we going to go and seek Jesus and be covered in his dust and his teachings? Let's look at Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 34. He says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth." And this is Jesus speaking. "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will find it. We must have that willingness to follow God, to follow Christ among everything else. If we find that our life in the culture of this, if we find our life in the culture of this world, we will be doomed. If we find our life in our own selfish fulfillment, we are doomed. But if we find our life in surrendering to Jesus Christ alone, that is where we will have a life overflowing. In John 10:10, it says, Jesus says, "I have come to give you life abundantly." We have life abundantly in Christ, so we don't need the things of this world. So what happens when we do let go of the world? What does that look like when we follow Jesus alone? So going back to Ezekiel, if you go to Ezekiel chapter 47. So in the few chapters before Ezekiel 47, Ezekiel has been given a vision. And he's been shown how to rebuild the temple and everything that needs to be done to rebuild the temple whenever the Israelites are given back their land, whenever their captivity is over with the Babylonians. And then we see that once the temple is rebuilt, that the glory of God fills the temple. And it's this beautiful, overwhelming experience. And then here we see in Ezekiel 47 what happens then when God's presence goes out from the temple. Let's look at Ezekiel 47, starting in verse 1. It says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced the east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out of the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits and then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Then he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through. For the water had risen, it was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, 'Son of man, have you seen this?' Then he led me back to the bank of the river. As I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on the outside and on the other side. And he said to me, 'This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And where the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, and the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything will live there where the river goes.'" So here we now see the temple is rebuilt, and the glory of God is there. And the water comes out, and it's trickling. It's just barely coming out of the temple. But as it goes further and further out into the world, it gets wider and deeper until it becomes a raging river that can't be passed. And then we see that this river gives life. There's trees and there's life all around it, and that makes the salt water fresh so that fresh sea life and creatures can live there. It brings life. It brings abundance. It takes a dead land and makes it new. In church, this is what happens when we as Christians look to Christ alone, when we follow Him alone, when we let go of the world and just focus on Him, when we walk in His dust, when we dwell in His Shekinah, when we untangle ourselves from the things of this world, and when we are willing to stand on Christ, life abundantly comes forth. Life that cannot be stopped, waters that are so deep they can't be passed, that they bring life. That is Jesus Christ, and that is the Lord that we serve. Now, I'm not saying all this today because it's easy. It's not. And I don't have it figured out. I really don't. It's a struggle that I have every day in my life to let go of this world. And I don't have a great solution for you. I don't have a 12-step program that if you do this, it's all going to get fixed. All I can say is we must dwell on the Word of God and follow it. We must spend time in prayer and seeking God's truth in our life, humbling ourselves to Him, giving ourselves over to Him relentlessly in the face of this world. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 says this, "For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Now, when Paul is speaking to the Galatian church here, he's telling them that they need to let go of the Jewish practices. Some of the Galatian folks in the Galatian church were telling people they needed to follow Jewish practices along with following Christ. And Paul is saying, no, those Jewish practices, that Mosaic law does not save you. Christ alone saves you. In church, that's the same for us as well. We only need Christ alone. There's no reason for us to go up and take sin. There's no reason for us to hold on to the things of this world. They've never saved us. They've never done anything for us but take us away from Christ. It is for freedom that we have been set free, so we don't need to pick up the sinful things of this world any longer. We need to stop them and live in the freedom of Christ alone. We need to stop keeping the world at an arm's length. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with this quote today that I think really brings it home. It's from Walter Brueggemann. And he says, "For I believe the crisis in the U.S. church has almost nothing to do with being liberal or conservative, but it has everything to do with giving up on the faith and discipline of our Christian baptism, and we are settling for a common, generic U.S. identity that is part patriotism, part consumerism, part violence, and part affluence. In other words, we need to stop keeping the world at an arm's length, and then we will truly find Christ in the life that we were meant to live." My Christian brothers and sisters, if you are here today and you are struggling, if there's something you need, maybe if you've held the world a little too closely and you need to let go of it, come and we will pray with you today. We will stand beside you. We will be your church family. We will hold you accountable and you can hold us accountable. And we can walk together towards Christ and the life and the freedom that He has given us. And if you're here today and you've yet to decide to follow Christ, I urge you to consider following Christ. Let go of the things of this world. The world only brings heartache. The world only brings emptiness. It does not bring life. Life and freedom is only found when we are baptized through the waters and come to know Jesus Christ alone. I ask you to put off the generic and to take on the ways of Christ, to walk in His dust, let His Shekinah dwell upon us, and let go of the ways of this world. So if there's anything you need, come forward as we stand and sing.